My lady, may I call George Osborne, please? Would you like to take the oath?
Please repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Is your full name George Gideon Oliver Osborne?
Yes, it is.
Thank you for the assistance that you've given to the inquiry thus far, Mr Osborne, provision of your witness statement and also documents. And thank you for coming to give evidence to the inquiry today. Please keep your voice up and speak into the microphones so that the stenographer can hear you for the transcript. You were Shadow Chancellor from 2005 to 2010, then Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2010 to 2016, and First Secretary of State from May 2015 to July 2016. Your witness statement is at INQ 000187308. It's on screen now. Please can you confirm that that is your witness statement and that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. My lady, may we have permission to publish it? Thank you. We can take that down. Before we start, Mr Osborne, I understand that you want to say a few words.
Well, I just wanted to express my heartfelt sympathy to all those who lost a loved one during the pandemic, and for those who feel things could have been done differently. I hope the inquiry gets to the bottom of what those things might have been.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you questions about whether or not the Treasury had a plan for a pandemic, and if so, what that was, and how the Treasury contributed to the government's planning for a pandemic. I emphasise from the outset that this examination is not a discussion or a debate about the merits or otherwise of the government's fiscal policy, or indeed the imposition of austerity. We will touch upon the effects of a sustained period of austerity in the United Kingdom, but only insofar as it relates to the state of the country's preparedness and resilience when COVID hit. In order to put your evidence in context, Mr Osborne, the Treasury is the government's economic and finance ministry. It maintains control over public spending and sets the direction of the United Kingdom's economic policy. And as Chancellor, you were the Minister of the government in charge of the Treasury. There are other important entities in the financial architecture that we will touch upon, including the Office for Budget Responsibility, which you set up during your tenure as Chancellor. In your witness statement, at paragraphs 7 to 11, we don't need to look at it. I'm going to attempt to summarise it. When you came to power immediately after the 2008 financial crisis, you imposed an economic policy intended to improve the United Kingdom public finances, and meaning that the United Kingdom was in better financial shape to face the pandemic when it hit. You say in your statement that your handling of the Treasury allowed the government to fund the furlough scheme and the bounce back loan scheme and other pandemic fallout, that you made reforms to financial services, which meant that there wasn't a banking crisis as a result of the COVID pandemic, and that you invested in research and development, importantly, vaccine development, which was important when COVID hit. Is that a fair summary of your explanation, as you give it in your witness statement, of the policy that you implemented?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So that gives us an understanding of how you believe the Treasury, under your watch, contributed to the government's preparedness for a pandemic. But I want to explore with you the plan that the Treasury had for a pandemic. You say at paragraph 16 in your witness statement that for the risks where the Treasury is allocated as a lead department, it develops scenarios and determines the potential impacts and likelihood of the risk in question. That was the case prior to the Covid-19 pandemic. So does it follow, Mr Osborne, that where the Treasury was not the lead government department, it didn't develop such scenarios?
Basically, yes. So if I might elaborate, I mean, there are certain crises which the Treasury is clearly directly responsible.
Such as a banking crisis.
A banking crisis,
Yes.
an economic crisis, a run on the pound. Sadly, our country has experienced many of these over the decades. And the Treasury is clearly the lead department, to pick up on the conversation that you've just been having with Oliver Letwin,
Yes.
for those crises. But when it comes to other kinds of crises that might affect a government, the Treasury is a contributor to the whole of government plan that usually another department leads. In the case of pandemics, the Department of Health.
The Department of Health, yes. So we'll look in a moment at how the Treasury assisted the Department of Health, being the lead government department for pandemic preparedness. But before we do, could we please display on the screen page 8, paragraph 20 of your witness statement and read through it together, please. You say here, between 2010 and 2016, Her Majesty's Treasury and therefore the Chancellor contributed to cross-government preparations for civil emergencies. This contribution broadly fell into 4 categories. A, the monitoring, assessing and managing of economic and fiscal risks. B, leading responsibility in government for monitoring and responding to risks to the stable operation of the UK financial system, learning the lessons of the financial crisis. C, setting budgets and applying spending controls and/or conditions for government departments, although noting that it was ultimately for the relevant Secretary of State to decide how to allocate their budgets. And D, preparing Her Majesty's Treasury's own corporate structures to enable effective crisis management, working closely with the Permanent Secretary and other senior officials, again learning from the financial crisis. So summarising those 4 points, you believed that the Treasury's job was to plan for economic and fiscal risks, a stable operation of the United Kingdom financial system, setting the budgets and applying spending controls, and also preparing the Treasury's own corporate structures to enable effective crisis management.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. Whilst this may well be a form of pandemic planning, these are all purely economic risks and matters which fall directly under the Treasury's remit in any event. These are the Treasury acting on business as usual, aren't they?
Well, the only thing I would draw attention to is that most whole country crises, of which a pandemic is an obvious example, but a devastating military attack, a catastrophic civil emergency of some kind, would probably lead to a second crisis, which is an economic or financial one. And indeed, in the spring of 2020, I wasn't in government, but it was clear for everyone observing government that they were not only dealing with a health emergency, but they were dealing with an economic emergency and a financial emergency. And a huge amount of effort, successful as it turns out, was put into trying to stabilize the markets, make sure the banking system didn't fall over. And so I think, it's quite hard to think of, crises on the scale of COVID that would not also have the potential to tip into a fiscal crisis and or a financial crisis, fiscal being about the ability of the government to fund itself, financial being about the ability of the banking system to cope with the crisis. So I think, unlike other things which you might look at, most major civil crises have the potential to tip into an economic and financial crisis.
All right. But given how central the Treasury is to the functioning of the United Kingdom and its economy, do you agree that there appears to have been no planning for external shocks which would have a major economic impact? In other words, no specific pandemic planning, no plan in the Treasury?
Well, I've been following the evidence given to this inquiry
Yes.
with interest and before appearing here, and you have covered this territory. I'm happy to cover it myself. But clearly, the UK, as indeed I think is the case of most Western democracies at the time, has an influenza plan. And the Treasury had done some work on what the impact of that would be. And it's a hit to GDP. There's an expected period when much of the workforce might be absent from work for a week or two. And there's, tragically in that case, there would be a high mortality rate. The Treasury basically had the structures to deal with that because there are already sickness benefits. There are already structures available for companies to pay people who are not working, who have the flu. And in the exercises that had been done before I came to office, there were some very specific supply chain issues that had been established if there was an influenza pandemic around things like the impact on the travel industry and the like, given what subsequently happened, very small scale.
Yes.
You're absolutely right that there was no planning done by the UK Treasury, or indeed, as far as I'm aware, any Western Treasury, for asking the entire population to stay at home for months and months on end, essentially depriving large sectors of the economy, like hospitality, of all their customers for months and months to come.
That could have been done, couldn't it?
Well, you're completely right that if someone had said, and I know that's absolutely core to what this module of the inquiry is looking at, if someone had said, you, the UK government, should be preparing for a lockdown that might last for months, then I've absolutely no doubt the Treasury would have developed the schemes that it did subsequently develop around the furlough, the COVID loans and the like. What I would say, in defence of the officials I work with, who were some of the most hardworking and dedicated public servants I've ever come across, is that in 2020, it turned out to be fairly easy and rapid to be able to put those support systems in place. Not all the other areas we're going to, I'm sure, cover around the health service, but the actual economic support schemes, like furlough, were designed by hardworking Treasury officials under a pressure situation very quickly and put in place. So yes, planning could have been done for a furlough scheme in advance. I'm not clear, observing it as at that point just a citizen, I'm not clear that that would have made a better furlough scheme than the one we actually, as a country, saw.
All right. Well, taking other examples than lockdown and furlough, using, for instance, a plan to consider the economic output required for self-isolation, or the COVID business interruption loans, or any economic effect of a mitigation action. None of that was done. There could have been planning, joined-up planning between the Department of Health, identifying what the mitigation actions were being considered, and the Treasury then coming in and dealing with a worst-case scenario, a middle-case scenario, and assessing whether or not the proposed mitigation actions were economically worthwhile. None of that sort of planning took place, did it?
Well, you're right that there was no planning in Britain, or indeed, as far as I'm aware, in France, Germany, United States, or anywhere else.
Well, we're dealing just with...
Well, yeah, but it's important because I think if you're challenging, the phrase that's come up here, groupthink, it was not a groupthink unique to this country. There was no assumption that you would ask the population to stay at home, or mandate that the population stay at home for months and months on end, and so there was no planning for a lockdown.
Whose fault was it that there was no prior thinking that could?
Well, I don't think it's particularly fair to sort of apportion blame, because the entire scientific medical community, again, hardworking individuals with the best of intentions, we're not elevating this particular possibility of a coronavirus that would have this level of contagion, have asymptomatic patients, and the Treasury, or indeed the Education Department or the criminal justice system, should pay attention and come up with some plans for if that was to happen. But if we had, I think, if you look at the planning for the influenza pandemic, and of course we don't know in practice, we'd have to come into contact with reality, how it would have fared. But it's clear that the Treasury, and indeed the rest of the government, responds to reasonable requests by saying, yes, please stock antivirals. Yes. Please have in place advanced vaccine purchasing agreements. Yes. Let's have some money set aside for call centres we can set up.
But
yes.
that is different that is very different to sitting down with the Department of Health and working out whether or not there would be such a catastrophic effect to a lockdown that it would have to be considered. And the benefit of considering that prior to the incident hitting is you're not making these decisions on the hoof.
What I would observe now, just as a citizen who very much wants this inquiry to come up with some good answers, is I don't think we still know the answer to some of those questions. I don't want to jump ahead for this inquiry, but should the schools have been locked down in the way they were? Even now, after the inquiry, after the pandemic, we don't know the answer to those questions. Well, certainly I don't, and maybe the inquiry can get to the bottom of that.
Well, they're certainly worth asking.
But, they are absolutely critical questions about balancing, the life expectancy of an 80-year-old versus the education opportunities of an 8-year-old. Incredibly hard questions, and it's not absolutely clear to me now that as a country we know, all the rest of the world knows what the answer to those things is. So I think it's the idea that all of this could have been sort of forethought, I don't think is the case. What I think is certainly the case is that if the expert community and governments had anticipated that there could be a pandemic that was not an influenza, but was another form of respiratory disease, and had characteristics that weren't like influenzas, like asymptomatic patients and so on, then clearly we could have done certain things, which hopefully I'm sure this inquiry will get around to recommending, to prepare for those things in advance, like stockpiling more PPE. But I've absolutely no doubt that as Chancellor, and indeed any of the Chancellors before me or subsequent to me, if they'd been asked to provide a budget for stockpiling PPE, 10, 20, 30 million pounds, whatever it would have been, as Oliver Letwin was pointing out, these are very small sums in the overall scheme of the government budget. And I'm pretty certain, like we said yes to everything we were asked to fund with an influenza pandemic, we would have said yes to those things too.
Should those questions have been asked?
Well, I'm with hindsight, yes, but I would say the one thing a Treasury can do, and I think it's a very powerful statement from the chair of the OBR in the witness evidence that I was shown, is he says, Richard Hughes, in the absence of perfect foresight, fiscal space may be the most valuable risk tool. Above all, as a country, whatever hits you, you need to be able to respond, to throw, in this case, large amounts of public funds at the problem without it leading to the thing I mentioned earlier, the fiscal crisis or the banking crisis that makes either the situation very much worse or indeed just removes the option of funding. Poorer countries in the world were not able to afford lockdowns. Poorer countries in the world were not able to provide loans for businesses to stay in operation. Right. So, this is not some academic question. And indeed, in our own country in the last 12 months, we saw in the autumn of last year, with the funding crisis for government debt, that this is not some abstract problem for the UK either. If you can't fund yourself, you cannot spend £340 billion on COVID support.
Well, you're going back with respect to the issue of funding. The questions were based around the lack of preparation, the lack of planning. You've raised. I would say that part of preparation and planning is, as an economy, to have flexibility to deal with whatever the world's going to throw. But that's only part of it, isn't it?
Of course.
And even recognising the questions that need to be asked, it is not a plan. Once those questions have been identified, there then has to be planning for the practicalities of what might take place. I just want to go to this statement of Richard Hughes, please, as you mention him. He's the chair of the Office of Budget Responsibility, as you say. His statement is at page INQ 000130270. And if we could go to page 5, please, and look at paragraph 6D of the witness statement. And whilst we're waiting for that to be put up on the screen, you will be aware of the evidence that Mr Cameron gave to the inquiry yesterday, that in his view, and indeed since he was instrumental in bringing into being the National Security Committee and with the security advisor supporting it, he believed that only a whole cross-government response to a pandemic and to these huge catastrophic risks was suitable and was going to work. Do you agree, Mr Osborne, that unless the Treasury is involved in proper joined-up thinking with the other lead government departments, then there is a piece of the jigsaw missing and it is not a cross-government response?
Yes, I do agree with that. And, institutionally, the Treasury is involved in every government decision because decisions can't come to the Cabinet, for example, until the Treasury has given its sign-off. So the Treasury, uniquely among the government departments, is already in the weeds of many, many decisions across government. But obviously, the nature of that involvement and the nature of the cooperation is incredibly important. And, I listened with great interest to what my former colleague Oliver Letwin was saying. I'd make one observation to the inquiry. Unfortunately, not all ministers are like Oliver Letwin with the kind of self-starting capacity to check everything and chase everything. And you can't build an entire system, unfortunately, around a future supply of Oliver Letwins.
No. That's a shame.
It is.
Looking at the document that we've got on screen then, this is, just to remind ourselves, from Richard Hughes, the Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility. And he says this: while it may be difficult to predict when catastrophic risks will materialise, it is possible to anticipate their broad effects if they do. The risk of a global pandemic was at the top of government risk registers for a decade before coronavirus arrived, but attracted relatively little and, in hindsight, far too little attention from the economic community. I'm going to pause there. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do. With
You can take that down.
but as he points out, with hindsight, it's not just the economic community, obviously, that doesn't give sufficient attention to the possibility of a coronavirus pandemic. It's all sorts of other communities, including the health community.
Yes.
I think there is your line of questioning is completely correct, because in my view, you're trying to get to the point which is, sorry, I shouldn't be anticipating what you say, but you're saying, why didn't we plan for a lockdown? Right. And the truth is, we didn't plan for a lockdown. No Treasury did. Before me, after me, no Treasury, as I'm aware, in the rest of the Western world. The influenza pandemic did not pose the same economic planning challenges that coronavirus subsequently did, because in an influenza pandemic, lots of people get sick. There's, tragically a mortality rate, and you have to deal with that. But people are off work for 1 week, and then they come back to work. They're not off work for months and months and months, or not off work, but absent from the workplace for months and months and months. There are not whole sectors of the economy like airlines that don't have anyone flying on them, or restaurants or pubs that don't have anyone visiting them.
No,
So,
and there's clearly a difference. Isn't
so
there?
there's a massive difference.
accept
So I
that.
think on the influenza pandemic planning, the Treasury, it was actually, the work was done before I arrived in office by the previous government, but they'd made an estimate that it would hit the economy around 3% of GDP. They'd made an estimate about how many people would be sick over a 6-month period. They had done some planning to make sure, and indeed during my period in office, there was planning to make sure that the banking system and the financial system could cope with the expected absenteeism of people having flu at home.
Yes.
It's completely different to what actually happened in 2020, 2021, where for months and months on end, no one was at work.
No, but if the analysis that
No one was at work at the workplace. Obviously,
okay.
people were working remotely.
If the analysis that you've just performed in the witness box had been undertaken prior to COVID hitting, then the Treasury would not have been flying blind in having to make the decisions and give the advice that they did. Why did that not happen?
Well, because no one said to us. I've said this actually in my witness statement. No one said to us there could be a a health pandemic that is not influenza, for which the likely response is you're going to have to shut down the economy for months and months on end. So that was not elevated to us as a health risk, and obviously the Treasury not trying to second guess all the, health experts. And this is not, I'm not disparaging the health experts who I work with very closely in government. It's just, it doesn't seem to me, and in all the documentation I've read, everything I've seen in the rest of much of the world, that anywhere else in the world people are saying you've got to prepare for this thing. And obviously the entire world is caught out by what has happened. And indeed, I don't actually, it's an interesting question, which is only entirely sort of unknowable. Would we all have gone into lockdown if China had not locked down in January or February? I think the Chinese lockdown is what gives the rest of the world the idea of a lockdown. And it's the overwhelming of the hospital system in northern Italy that then leads all Western governments to reach basically the same conclusion, which is we've got to do what the Chinese have done in order to try and preserve our capacity in our emergency wards. And I wonder, but it's unknowable, that if we'd done a kind of tabletop exercise in 2011, 2012,
Yes.
that we would have come to the conclusion you could lock down the entire population. Whether that would have even been a feasible policy option, as it turned out to be.
We'll never know because it was never done, was it? We asked the Treasury to provide us with any plans, pandemic plans, and evidence of what in fact was done in the time that you were Chancellor. And Catherine Little, who is the Treasurer's second permanent secretary, has provided a witness statement, which I know you will have read, Mr. Osborne. And in it, she says that because the Treasury doesn't hold direct responsibility for pandemic preparedness, that is at the door of the Department of Health, we should ask them for any pandemic preparations and to see whether they have any records of any pandemic preparations, including at the Treasury. So we have been provided with plans such as they existed, and they are appended to Catherine Little's statement. The ones that remain with the Treasury. And the only material which the inquiry has been furnished with post-2010 is a project to fund a call centre and purchase antibiotics, both in 2012, and requests dealing with the funding of the pandemic flu clinical countermeasure, Tamiflu. Other than those, held within the Treasury, there are no plans, no reaction to any of the Department of Health mitigation proposals, and nothing specifically relating to any pandemic threat. Do you accept that?
Well, what I would accept is that there are, I would say, the items you cite are examples of to my knowledge, 100% of the requests made of the Treasury to fund things that would help deal with a influenza pandemic are funded. And you gave the examples there. There is also a whole set of planning that goes on during this period to deal with banking crises and endless exercises which I took part in, and structures with us and the Bank of England and the Prudential Regulatory.
But we're talking about pandemic planning.
No, but that was, so pandemic, I think, that would have been part of the thinking, which is if there's a crisis, can the banking system cope? But there's not, I don't want to repeat myself. There is not planning for a coronavirus pandemic.
Should there have been a plan, a blueprint, some sort of playbook from the Treasury containing strategies and plans that could have been turned to and considered when something like the pandemic occurred?
Well, with hindsight, yes. But as I've said, I question whether in 2011, 2012, 2013, if someone had come to us and said, right, there's going to be a coronavirus pandemic and we're going to ask the whole population to stay indoors for 3 months, I wonder in 2011, 12, 13, whether anyone would have thought that was a plausible plan. I mean, it turned out to be one, but after other parts of the world had started doing it.
Right. If there had been a series of papers, a series of levels of consideration given to different scenarios dealing with different assumptions. So whether what was coming down the line might be symptomatic or asymptomatic, how quickly it was likely to reproduce as a disease, then in advance of COVID hitting, you would know as Chancellor which economic levers would need to be pulled and how best the Treasury could support the mitigation actions of the Department of Health. And the problem with not having that thinking taken place at some time before the pandemic hits is that, as I've said before, the result of that is the Treasury's acting on the hoof.
Well, I don't think that's entirely fair. So first of all, the Treasury is by its nature, it's not a big delivery department. It has around 1,000 individuals who are exceptionally capable civil servants who can deploy their talents and abilities to different policy problems as the world throws them. In the last 2 years, they've suddenly had to deal with the Ukraine and energy supplies in the way that the Treasury would not have had a big standing capability to do with before. But that's one of the great strengths of the British Treasury. There are definitely, following your line of questioning, things that we could have done if this kind of threat of a coronavirus pandemic had been identified in advance. So we could have, I'm making sort of, I think, straightforward observations, like we could have stockpiled more PPE because we might have anticipated that the whole world would want to get hold of this material, and it was only being produced in a certain number of factories on the other side of the world, and the US government was doing everything to get hold of it, and so we could have stockpiled more of that. For example, we could have maybe looked at things like having more respirators in hospitals than we would normally carry in the health service, but that was not identified as a particular need. I think the sort of broader question of, I don't want to repeat myself, would we have anticipated the lockdown? I just don't know the answer to that. All I know is that when the actual debate came in March 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty in our own country about whether it was the right policy response and whether the population would accept it as a policy response. So I wonder 10 years in advance whether we would have resolved those questions. The one thing I'm sure of is, there's no point having a contingency plan you can't pay for. And absolutely central to all of this is the ability of your economy and your public finances to flex in a crisis.
The OBR, mentioned it a few moments ago, it is an organisation that you implemented during your time in office. And part of the assistance that it gives to the Treasury is the preparation and presentation of fiscal risk reports. Can you explain to us what those are, please?
Well, these were, so the OBR was created very shortly after I came to office. It gave an independent assessment of the public finances. And it's not just, I think it's important for people to understand, it's not just another think tank with a sort of another set of finances, another set of forecasts. These are the government's forecasts. There's not some other set of government forecasts. In other words, the forecasts for GDP, for unemployment, for tax revenues and so on are independently produced, but they are the official government forecasts. And that is the central role of the OBR. And to do that, it is privy to secret information in government. So it is privy to the budget decisions. I gave 8 budgets. It knew what was in the budget weeks before the general public did, or indeed weeks before members of the cabinet would know what was in a budget. So it's a very important institution at the heart of government. And we sought to add to its capability by asking it to undertake essentially assessments of potential risks to the UK and what impact they would have on the public finances. Well, they were issues like, I think, they looked at everything from a no-deal Brexit to climate change to all sorts of, things that might have an impact on the UK and what the fiscal consequences of that would be. So the actual crisis was not a fiscal crisis. It was what was going to be the cost, basically, of these various things that they looked at.
And there were business as usual risks, as they defined, weren't there? And then there were also one-off events recognised and reflected in their risk analysis. And in July of 2017, the OBR produced as part of its report this statement On top of the business as usual risks, there could be one-off events that generate demand for additional health spending, such as a large-scale outbreak of disease, for example, an influenza pandemic, which the Cabinet Office considers to represent the most significant civil emergency risk. Long-term systemic cost pressures could also arise from sources such as an increase in antimicrobial resistance. So there was some recognition in the risks that were identified by the OBR of that which is contained in the National Risk Register.
Yes, that's right. I've left office by this point. I think the OBR actually tell us that they had considered doing the influenza scenario planning, but in fact they switched their resources to looking at a no-deal Brexit scenario instead.
Right. Well, my question for you on this topic is this. Does it surprise you, given what I've just read out, to know that despite there being an acknowledgement of the influenza pandemic being the most significant emergency risk identified by the National Risk Register, that the pandemic, did not appear as a risk on the fiscal list?
Well, I think I don't know if you're taking evidence from the OBR, oral evidence, but they made their own decisions about what they thought were part of their independence, was to make their own decisions about what they thought they should look at. I imagine the government at the time would not have wanted them to look at a no-deal Brexit scenario, for example. So it's incredibly important they're independent and made those decisions. So you'd have to ask them that question.
All right. Well, do you accept, I appreciate you're not in office anymore, but perhaps you will accept from me that by July 2021, the OBR had changed its approach to risks, particularly those identified in the National Risk Register, in two ways. Firstly, there was a broader focus in its report of 3 major risks rather than 97 individual risks. And one of those 3 major risks that is now covered in great detail is the risk of a pandemic. And secondly, there appears to be much more joined-up thinking now between the risks identified by the OBR, the fiscal risks, and those identified in the National Risk Register. So they have adapted and learned from what happened during the crisis.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think they specifically in that case are looking at what happens if there's a coronavirus strain that the vaccines aren't effective against. So yes, absolutely. But of course, look, I would say what it points to is try and put in place the right machinery. I wish this inquiry, every success in trying to anticipate what we could do in the future for different crises. But the truth is we're not going to be able to anticipate every crisis that hits the United Kingdom over the rest of our lifetimes. And therefore having, a strong OBR, a treasury with the capacity to come up with quick policy making, central government machinery that can respond quickly to, that is also important, that's also important, as well as trying to anticipate specific crises that you can specifically plan for.
Can we put up, please, the witness statement of Sir Mark Walport, which is at INQ 000147707, and go to paragraph 86 at page 33. And given what you've just said, Mr. Osborne, about the fact that not every eventuality can be predicted or planned for, I'd like your view on what Sir Mark says here at paragraph 86. Every national emergency has knock-on effects on citizens' lives beyond the immediate impact of the emergency itself. And there is always the possibility that the cure for this specific emergency, in terms of the policies and actions directed at stemming the primary damage, causes harmful side effects. In the case of a pandemic, lockdowns and quarantining, closing international borders and other restrictions to travel, closing of institutions such as schools and businesses, all have serious adverse consequences. This raises important questions for policymakers about how to balance the direct harms from the pandemic infection against the adverse consequences of interventions, singly or in combination. That statement highlights, does it not, the importance of a department trying its level best to anticipate not only what's coming down the line, but also what is going to be the effect of the mitigation actions that might have to be taken.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this, Mark, I know Mark very well and have worked with him. This goes to my mind, the heart of the, very difficult question that the government of the day had to wrestle with, and any future government would have to wrestle with, which is, what are the costs and benefits of dealing with the health problem, the spread of the disease, versus the impact of closing a school. I had school-aged children at the time of the pandemic. Closing the court system so that people don't get their trial. Locking down prisoners in prisons. All sorts of other things that had a really damaging impact. And you go to the heart of very difficult sort of societal questions, of which, frankly, I don't. You can produce any amount of economic analysis of what's the benefit of controlling coronavirus for a day and shutting a school for a day. But I think in the end they come down to essentially kind of human societal judgments of what are the things we value. And the truth is, different human beings will value different things. Some people will say the education of the child is more important than, protecting older patients in our, care homes. But ultimately we have democratic governments that are accountable to the general public in order to try and make those very difficult decisions. If this inquiry can help any future government, if I'm not sure, my lady, if I'm allowed to say this, but I personally think of this, your inquiry, which I strongly support. If you can give some kind of guidance to answering that question, it is the single most useful thing this inquiry can do for any future government, which will be faced with very difficult questions like the government was faced in 2020.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Osborne, in the answer that you've just given, that it was not worth the Treasury attempting to engage in any significant planning because the decisions have to be made when the pandemic hits?
No, the Treasury did not engage in the planning because no one had anticipated that you would have to, or you would have the option of, or it would be something you should consider, locking down the economy in order to deal with an asymptomatic non-influenza respiratory pandemic.
An answer you've already given. And may I suggest that had the Treasury been interested in engaging in pre-pandemic planning, then it would have taken a bigger part in the two exercises that took place during your tenure and just after you'd left. Looking at the reports into Exercise Alice that took place in February of 2016, and indeed was an exercise dealing with the outbreak of a coronavirus, the Treasury wasn't even present. In Exercise Cygnus, which was delivered shortly after you left office, but as we know from yesterday, planning for which commenced in 2014, although the Treasury is recorded as being present at that exercise, there is no evidence whatsoever of any participation or of any evidence of any lessons to be learned. Is that the sort of action that the Treasury could have taken in order to engage itself with these important exercises, looking at what the result and the reaction of the government would be in the outbreak of these sorts of diseases?
Well, this is territory that the inquiry has covered, and we've covered it a bit in the evidence. I think the Treasury was very engaged in drawing up an influenza pandemic plan. I think those exercises were kind of operational exercises in how that plan might actually be put into practice in hospitals and other, facilities. In which there wouldn't be a sort of particular role at that moment for a Treasury policymaker. The Treasury being, as I say, a department of policymakers rather than a delivery department. So it wouldn't have been directly affected by what the delivery services of government had to do in an influenza pandemic. And there was the Treasury had signed off, indeed I had signed off on the 2011 influenza plan, in which the Treasury had, as you can see from the material in 2009, had assessed the economic costs, had identified a couple of specific issues, but essentially was, said, okay, it's a 3% hit to GDP, but we're not going to have widespread sectoral impacts which we need to think of, or we're not going to have to design some system to pay people to work from home.
All right. Do you agree, Mr. Osborne, that by the time that COVID-19 hit, the consequences of austerity were a depleted health and social care capacity and rising inequality in the United Kingdom?
Most certainly not. I completely reject that. I would make 2 points. The first of all, it's not surprising that the biggest economic crash that Britain experienced since the 1930s has an impact on Britain and on poverty and on unemployment and on people's life chances. That's unfortunately what happens when your country experiences such a massive economic shock as we experienced in 2008-9. What flows from that is a whole set of things, and one of them is seriously impaired public finances, which you then have to repair, and that is what we set about doing. I would say if we had not done that, Britain would have been more exposed, not just to future things like the coronavirus pandemic, but indeed to the fiscal crises which very rapidly followed in countries across Europe, such as Spain, Italy, Greece, Ireland, Slovenia, all across the continent. And indeed, one point, there was a question mark over whether France itself would experience a fiscal crisis. So all across the continent, other countries are experiencing problems of being unable to fund themselves on the international debt markets. And as I point out, in the autumn of last year, Britain went through this briefly for a couple of weeks. So this is not some kind of academic problem that doesn't materialize. It's a very real problem. And if we had not had a clear plan to put the public finances on a sustainable path, then Britain might have experienced a fiscal crisis. We would not have had the fiscal space to deal with the coronavirus pandemic when it hit 7 years later. And indeed, as Mr. Cameron pointed out yesterday, the example in many of those countries that did have those crises was there were real cuts in health services and other public services that went far beyond what the UK experienced, or in case of the NHS, actually budgets went up in real terms.
Do you agree that during your time in office, the state of the social care system became worse?
I'm not sure I would accept that. I would certainly accept that there are rising pressures that, including during my period in office, on the social care system.
All right. Well, can I ask you to
yeah,
pause
but
there,
they are
please?
driven by the fact Britain has a rapidly aging population.
Yes.
Oh, not rapid, sorry.
Well, we'll come
an
to the
aging
detail of
population
it.
at a relatively rapid rate. And that the cost of medical treatments are going up, which is actually generally a good thing because these are new treatments that can help people. But the UK social care and health system is experiencing exactly the same kinds of pressures as the pressures being experienced in most Western democracies at this moment.
Right. Well, let's look at the detail, please. Can we have up on screen INQ 000189677? Now, this is a report by the Institute for Government, the government think tank, whose strapline is inspiring the best in government and working to make government more effective. This is a report that was prepared by the authors sitting in the bottom left-hand corner. It's headed, How Fit Were Public Services for Coronavirus? And we don't need to go to it, but just to set this in context, this is a report based on extensive desk research, analysis of government data, and interviews of civil servants, frontline staff, representative bodies, and other experts. Can we go, please, to page 8 of this report and highlight the final 2 paragraphs and zoom in on those? Even before the crisis began, that's the COVID crisis, public services had seen reduced access, longer waiting times, missed targets, rising public dissatisfaction, and other signs of declining standards. Most notably, GPs and hospitals were missing almost all routine targets, whilst prisons had experienced a dramatic increase in levels of self-harm, violence, and poor prisoner behaviour. This context made it far harder for services to maintain acceptable standards while also managing a disruption as wide-ranging and long-lasting as that wrought by the coronavirus. The response has also been hampered by historic underinvestment in buildings and equipment. Government has consistently underspent its capital budgets, often using money that had been earmarked for long-term investment to cover holes in day-to-day budgets. As a result, public services have had to operate out of crumbling prisons, courthouses and hospitals that are difficult to clean or repurpose in line with coronavirus health measures. And can we move down to finish this on the following page, please? The sale of courthouses and police stations and the failure to build new prison places have similarly made it harder to maintain social distancing. And inadequate ICT has reduced the ability of police officers and local authority staff to work from home, made it far harder for prisoners confined in cells for more than 23 hours a day to access training or speak to their families, and meant that schools, hospitals, GPs and criminal courts have all struggled at times to provide services remotely, even when greatly reduced. Now there's repeated reference there to prisons and court centres, and indeed those will be covered in detail in later modules. So I just want to focus for the moment on what the Institute for Government have found in terms of the state of the health public services and the ability for them to react to coronavirus. Is that picture something that you recognise?
The short answer is no, because by the time I left office, there were more doctors working in the NHS, more nurses working in the NHS. As Mr. Cameron pointed out yesterday, diagnostic testing had increased in the NHS and public satisfaction had remained broadly constant during a difficult period for the economy and for the constraint of spending in public finances. I'd make a general observation. I mean, if you put all this together, the health service, the criminal justice system, the education system, the social care system, I think basically you've just left out defence, but if we had some generals here, they'd no doubt want some more tanks. That is public spending. So you can't just say, well, we'd like public spending to be higher without then explaining where you're going to get the money from. I've pointed out the risks of borrowing the money, so you can certainly go to the general population and say, please, will you pay more taxes? I would note the present Prime Minister just last year proposed a national insurance rise to pay for the NHS, and it was rejected by his own party and by the opposition. So, in other words, this is the job of the Chancellor Exchequer. Right. You are going straight to the heart of it, which is you've got to balance all of these competing demands within public services for different services wanting more money, plus the constraints on a country of borrowing the money in international markets, plus the constraints on the general population just willy-nilly paying more tax. And the taxpayer is also a core participant in that sense to this inquiry, which is he's got to pay for all of this.
The point that you're making, Mr. Osborne, and in your witness statement, you claimed that the Department of Health funding for the NHS was ring-fenced or was increased, in fact, year on year during the course of your time as Chancellor, whilst other departments were reduced by up to 19%.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'd like to explore that with you, please.
I would make one point.
Please just let me ask my question.
Of course.
I'd like to explore that in terms of social care and in terms of public health, because from the time of the implementation of the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, it's right, isn't it, that certainly certain of the public health responsibilities moved from the National Health Service over to local authorities and therefore came outside of the budget, that part of the budget that the Department of Health would give to the National Health Service. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. So in terms of whether or not the funding for public health had been ring-fenced in the way in which you describe in your witness statement, what we have to in fact look at is how the local public health was being funded through the local authorities. And in order to do this and to demonstrate my point, can we put up, please, INQ 000 205 178, which is the witness statement of Dr. Klaas Kershele. And can we go to page 70 and paragraph 108? I'd like your comment on this, please, once we've read through it, Mr. Osborne. Functioning of the new local and national public health structures was compromised by austerity politics. At the local level, the abolition of PCTs meant that overall public health performance was strongly dependent on local authority capabilities to commission and deliver effective services. Ministers had promised to ring-fence the public health budget for local authorities. However, an in-year cut of £200 million in 2015 was followed by further reductions over the next 5 years. According to the Local Government Association, this amounted to a real-term reduction of the public health grant from over 3.5 billion in 2015 to 16 to just over 3 billion in 2020 to 21, a loss of 14%. Other estimates by the Institute for Public Policy Research spoke of an even more dramatic reduction from 850 million in net expenditure between 2014-15 and 2019-20, with the poorest areas in England experiencing disproportionately high cuts of almost 15%. Resulting pressures on local public health were exacerbated by an overall 49% real-term cut in central government funding for local authorities between 2010-11 and 2016-17, and a resulting practice of top slicing, whereby authorities reallocated ring-fenced public health budgets to other services broadly impacting health and well-being, such as trading standards or parks and green spaces. In 2010, Healthy Lives, Healthy People had promised to give local government the freedom, responsibility and funding to innovate and develop their own ways of improving public health in their area. Freedom and responsibility had been granted, but funding was often lacking. What do you say about that, Mr. Osborne?
Well, there are several things I'd say about this. I mean, first of all, I think it's universally accepted that the decision, which was not mine, it was taken elsewhere in the government, but the decision to transfer public health from the NHS to local authorities has turned out to be, broadly speaking, a good thing. There is no one, as far as I'm aware, arguing that it should be returned to the NHS.
What about the funding position?
Well, we'll come on to the funding position, but the central, because this is actually, also helps address the funding point. So first of all, that was an important decision, and it meant that public health decisions were tied in with other decisions that local government takes around housing and the licensing, recreation facilities, and so on. Second, as it happens, during the period I was Chancellor, the public health budget went up. The numbers you refer to are from 2015 to 2020. I left office shortly after 2015. But I would make a broader point, which is, here there's a kind of challenge, which is a classic policy-making challenge of to what extent do you try and ring-fence things and say local authorities must spend this money on this particular thing. Indeed, public inquiries of all kinds have generally led to conclusions that budgets should be ring-fenced for the thing the public inquiry was looking at. Yes. And then over time, a local authority has less and less discretion about how to spend money, because this bit's ring-fenced, that bit's ring-fenced, and so on. And you erode local decision-making and local democracy, and you also end up with a whole load of siloed individual ring fences. So as a government, the Cameron government, of which I was an active part, was actually promoting localism, and indeed we went further in devolving power, such as indeed the NHS and public health and social services in Manchester to the Greater Manchester Authority.
But to work, the system has to be properly funded, doesn't it?
Well, then you come to the point which is, and by the way, local government has its own resources. It can raise or cut local taxes. Part of the taxation system is in the hands of local government. But I would make the point. First of all, money is not the solution to all public health problems. I introduced a sugar tax, which has, I believe, had a big impact on reducing sugary drinks and helping with obesity levels in the UK. Smoking during the Cameron government reduced as quite dramatically the amount of the population, proportion of the population smoking. So you can do all sorts of other things to help with public health. If you're coming back to like the public health budget, well, then
that's what
okay. Well, then that which straddles several different parts of government again comes into the general question you've got of which budgets you're going to cut, or what money you're going to borrow, or what taxes you're going to put up.
Right.
And we had made a decision to ring fence the NHS and indeed to ring fence some of these public health grants By the way, I might just observe that Public Health England, which we created, was absolutely instrumental in coming up, I think, within 3 days for a test with coronavirus. So we did put in place structures that in 2020 did deliver in the case of developing a very rapid test, which was required for this brand new disease.
Well, I'm going to suggest, Mr. Osborne, that Public Health England failed in its mission to increase the country's public health. You will know that your Secretary of State for Health and then Health and Social Care, Jeremy Hunt, has provided a witness statement to the inquiry in which he says that he acknowledges that during his time as Secretary of State, the NHS required more funding. There was, as you have already acknowledged, a rapidly rising demand for services, an ageing population, that he considered that there were staffing capacities within the system that were causing difficulties, and that the NHS workforce requirements, which have historically been considered in an ad hoc way, need to be sorted out in order for the National Health Service to properly support the capacity that's required. And that's in normal circumstances. But when one takes that into account when the pandemic hit, do you accept his criticisms that the system was not working as properly as it should be? And that part of the reason for that must have been the funding.
Well, I read his evidence, which I thought was very good and had some interesting and constructive ideas for the future around testing capabilities and so on, and lessons to be learned from South Korea and Taiwan and other countries. I think from memory, he actually identifies Brexit and immigration as one of the problems, that the health service had relied on a stream of people coming into the country to fill posts in nursing and other parts of the medical profession, and that proved problematic during the period he was health secretary. I had by then left the government. All
right. Do you agree that however well funded you say the NHS was during your time as Chancellor, it simply wasn't enough?
No, I don't accept that. I mean, what I accept is you could spend more money on the NHS, just like you could spend more money on the court system, more money on the school system, more money on the army. But you have to make a calculation of balancing the resources each of those services get, and the central calculation, which every household has to make, is what can we actually afford? Because what's the revenue that's coming in? And so I think we prioritised health. I would also it's not insignificant that at the 2010 general election, this is exactly what we said we were going to do: cut other areas but increase health. We went into the general election telling the public we were going to cut those other services. And in 2015, we also said the same thing. And on both cases, the public put their confidence in us. So in terms of also democratic accountability, I don't think the public were misled about what the government would do. And the evidence of the 2015 election were prepared to continue to place their trust in us.
Can we display, please, INQ 000119293? This is the OBR's first fiscal risk report from July of 2017. I've already made reference to it. And can we go to paragraph 162 and look at, page 162, and look at paragraphs 6.66 and 6.67. This was the risk report provided a year after you had left office. And if we can look, please, at, in fact, 6.66 we will start with. Thank you very much. It's headed Pressures on the Adult Social Care Budget and How Government Has Responded. As with health, there are visible signs of pressure on the adult social care system. In the past 2 years, governments have announced top-up funding and delayed reforms that would increase costs further. The government has stated that further reform is required to ensure that the system is prepared to meet the challenges of the increasing numbers of over 75s, and that it will work with partners at all levels, including those who use services and who work to provide care, to bring forward proposals for public consultation. Signs and sources of pressure on the adult social care budget include pressure on local authority budgets has fed through to adult social care. For those authorities in England with responsibility for adult social care, it is their largest item of discretionary spending. Local authority budgets have been squeezed by cuts to grant funding and limits on council tax rises. As a result, English local authorities' total net current expenditure fell by 13.3% in real terms between 2010 to 11 and 2015 to 16. Within this, total spending on adult social care fell by less, but local authority spending on it still fell by 9.1% over the same period, including transfers from the NHS. Spending on adult and children's social care exceeded local authorities' budgets in 2014 to 15 and by a bigger margin of 2015 to 16. This is the organisation that you created, telling us here that so far as local authority budgets are concerned and adult social care is concerned, the picture was not great. Do you agree?
Well, I'm not saying, sure it does say that, to be honest. I mean, I think it points out that there are pressures on the adult social care system. That's a statement of the obvious in all advanced democracies at the moment. And then it goes to point out that there were reductions in the local government budget. Yes, there were. We announced, they're not like secret reductions in the local government budget. They were publicly announced as part of a programme of trying to reduce government expenditure. But if you exclude local government, education, defence, criminal justice, and the NHS, you haven't got anything left. That is what public expenditure is, plus welfare spending, which people also are not keen on having reduced. So welfare entitlements. So yes, there were reductions in local government budgets. That's because the country had had an enormous financial crash, was poorer than it had been before, was going to be permanently poorer. There was an impact on it. Its permanent potential had been impacted by the crash. And we had to try and make sure that public expenditure fitted the size of the economy, whilst getting the economy growing and putting people into work and reducing poverty, which all happened under our watch as well. So we got the economy going so that you could afford to spend ultimately more on those things. I would just say on social care, it's really straightforward. There are two people who can pay for social care. The taxpayer can pay, and then you've got to be prepared for higher levels of general taxation. Rishi Sunak's NHS and social care levy was rejected by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the last year. Or you can ask people to sell their homes, the assets they have, to pay for that social care. There's no one else who's going to pay for it, the taxpayer or the individual. And the political system for 20 years under governments of all colours have rejected those two options, which is why you continually read that there's an ongoing debate about what the social care problem is unsolved. That's because the solutions are currently unpalatable to the political system, which I would suggest is a reflection of being unpalatable to the broader taxpayer and society.
But what about the effect of the falling expenditure? You know that last week the inquiry has heard from Professors Marmot and Bamborough, who told the inquiry that changes in the social determinants of health because of austerity since 2010 were likely to be the causes of the adverse changes in health and health inequalities in the UK. And also, I know that you've had sight of the statement of Professor Kevin Fenton, the president of the United Kingdom Faculty of Public Health, who's told the inquiry that a key lesson learned through the pandemic has been the importance of robust engagement with potentially disproportionately affected populations, both in the planning and preparedness. What I want you to consider, Mr. Osborne, is firstly that government policy had an effect on health and social care, which meant that those in the worst situations of society were disproportionately affected when COVID hit. And secondly, that was identifiable, it was predictable, and it should have been part of the government planning.
I just completely reject that. And in the case of the Marmot and Bamborough report, and obviously there's a lot of very interesting work on health inequalities, which we did a huge amount to seek to address. They have this statement of paragraph 151, national economic wealth, i.e. GDP, has long been considered as the major global determinant of population health. Of course. In other words, that's what happened. Britain had a huge economic crash, the greatest since the 1920s and 30s Great Depression. And of course that had an impact on poverty in the country. It would have been worse, in my view, and in the view of many other people, including the Governor of the Bank of England at the time, Mervyn King, had we not then also tried to address the risk to the public finances, because that would have led to a fiscal crisis, like you saw across much of Europe, that would have meant even less funding for these public services. We tried to protect the health service during that austerity programme. And Marmot and Bamber themselves say that they can't directly establish causality between austerity and the mortality rates they look at. And the only example I can find in their report of a country that they cite that has a stimulus programme is Iceland, which, by the way, has a population about the size of the borough that this courthouse is in, right? And then even in the same paragraph go on to point out that Iceland had some severe health effects from the crisis. And they leave out the United States, which was the primary example of a country in the West that tried a stimulus program as opposed to an austerity program, because they say, oh, yes, well, actually, mortality fell there. I've even done my own research and found out that mortality fell in Germany for the poorest population, part of the population during the period I was Chancellor. And I don't think anyone thinks that Germany pursued a particularly tough austerity program during that period. So I just reject I would centre on their central conclusion, which is national economic wealth has long been considered as the major global determinant of population health.
So your evidence, Mr. Osborne, is that although you acknowledge that in certain aspects the effects of COVID were felt more keenly by those most disadvantaged in society, that has no connection whatsoever to the effects of austerity that were brought in 2010.
That's absolutely my contention.
Right.
It is true that pandemics will affect poorer people more severely, and that is one of the great tragedies, which is why we try and alleviate poverty and direct services towards them. I think everything we did to try and ring-fence the NHS budget, to provide stable finances so that they were not further affected by a fiscal crisis, things like universal credit, which were introduced, all of these things were done to try and protect the poorest part of the population. Indeed, I was the first Chancellor ever to publish distributional analysis of the effect of my policies of budget after budget, precisely to show that we were trying to direct resources in constrained times to the poorest and most vulnerable, who are indeed generally more exposed to things like pandemics, tragically.
Mr. Osborne, thank you.
How are we doing? Because I think, if I may say so, Mr. Osborne and I share a tendency, which is to speak very fast. And the stenographer, I'm afraid, has had a tough morning. So
I only have two more.
You think you can finish by
questions.
1 o'clock?
Yes, I will finish by 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Can I apologise to you, my lady, for talking too quickly for the stenographer?
Don't worry, I do it too. So I'm afraid we're in the same camp.
Two final questions, please. The first, going back to health economics, and I'd like to put to you the statement made by Professor Sir Chris Whitty in his witness statement. We don't need to put it up. But he has told the inquiry this: there may be a need to look at operational issues and the cost effectiveness of particular interventions within CMO or SAGE advice. So health economics may be relevant to the medical and scientific advice. This is because giving advice which is operationally unfeasible or substantially disproportionate in cost or difficulty is not especially helpful. And that is mirrored and expanded by the witness statement of Professor John Edmonds from the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he says this: there needs to be far greater attention paid to the economic impact of pandemics and the interventions aimed at controlling them. Oh, thank you very much. It's on the screen. The economics of outbreaks is a specialised field. Interventions can have major knock-on effects so that individuals who are not directly reached or targeted by the intervention can still benefit, as they have a reduced risk of infection from others. These knock-on effects need to be incorporated into the analysis to avoid underestimating the benefits of public health actions. Just pausing there. Do you agree with these two scientific experts that there needs to be joined up thinking between the science and the economy?
Yes, absolutely. But I would observe that, if you're trying to think through how a future government might deal with
Yes.
a pandemic, it's not just the health impacts. You know, you have to, what I think the government wrestled with at the time, I wasn't in it, but I can see as an external observer and with my experience, was also the educational impacts, the criminal justice impacts, and the like of the lockdown, and trying to balance those. If you can apply more, and indeed the impact on businesses and people's employment. If you can certainly apply more analysis to all of that. I personally think you're going to end up with a very difficult, essentially sort of human judgment of, are you valuing education over health in some cases, and that is a very, and other examples like that. And that's an incredibly hard trade-off, which I guess we have, in our country, elected governments to try and make on our behalf.
All right, thank you. Finally, let's just look at the consequences of failing to plan. And can we display, please, INQ 0000872005, and look at paragraph 16 at page 4 of the Pandemic Diseases Capabilities Board review of April 2022. Paragraph 16, please. In line with the National Security Risk Assessment methodology, revised pandemic reasonable worst-case scenario models represent unmitigated scenarios and so do not include a full risk assessment for the use of NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. Given that the imposition of lockdown, in part, accounted for a 25% drop in GDP between February and April 2020, the largest drop on record, and numerous secondary and tertiary impacts on all sectors, this represents a significant gap in the UK's assessment of pandemic risk. Noting that, even without government intervention, we would anticipate spontaneous behaviour change and subsequent economic damage. What is more, the secondary and tertiary impact of these measures will have been unevenly spread throughout society, highlighting and in areas exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. Now, can we go to page 5 and paragraph 18? And can we highlight 18, 19 and 20, please? The unprecedented use of NPIs and significant changes in public behaviour seen during the COVID-19 pandemic required the provision of far greater economic support than pre-COVID planning assumptions suggested. The planning assumptions in the 2011 UK influenza pandemic preparedness strategy focused on the economic impacts of sickness absences. As a result, the strategy did not include many of the significant economic impacts which we have seen during this pandemic, such as the dramatic drops in economic activity, significant shifts and reductions in consumer spending, and disruption to global supply chains. The OBR's Fiscal Risks Report from July 2021, which we've looked at, suggests the United Kingdom's real GDP declined by an unprecedented 9.8% in 2020, and as of September 2021, the NAO estimated the lifetime cost of government spending on COVID-19 will reach £370 billion. Clearly then, in line with recommendation 2.1, our economic risk assessment for pandemics must be updated to include a broader range of impacts, including the significant potential impacts of NPIs and behavioural changes on different sectors of the economy. Do you agree with that conclusion, Mr. Osborne?
Well, I do. I absolutely agree with the conclusion. Knowing the brilliant civil servants of the Treasury, I suspect they've already done it for you. There already will be a load of internal assessments of the future effect of, for example, coronavirus variations that don't have vaccines at the moment that are effective, were they to emerge.
Yes.
But I would make, I guess my sort of, where we started with this was, did the Treasury or indeed any other government part of government, or indeed any other Western government, anticipate that it might require a lockdown that would impact the economy, as it says here, by a drop of 25% of GDP? No, they didn't. But through the programme we pursued as a government, we created the fiscal space so we could end up spending £370 billion to help people deal with all the adverse effects that the lockdown introduced in terms of their education, the way the criminal justice system worked, and above all, their employment. And we kept people as a country economically in a much better shape than they would have been if we'd not been able to spend that money. And that's because we created the fiscal space. It meant we avoided the banking crisis, and we did that because of the reforms that happened during the period that I was in government and as a result of the determined effort to fix the roof.
I'm sure that in subsequent modules, the inquiry will be told whether or not these plans are indeed now in practice. But if that's right, Mr. Osborne, it's a shame that this wasn't done before, isn't it?
Well, I would just point out no one I'm aware of anywhere in the Western world, maybe anywhere in the world, said, you know what governments should prepare for? They should prepare for a coronavirus pandemic that will require us to lock down